Think about a world with no instant communication. A world where travel was a long, dangerous journey, and where most people never ventured more than a few miles from where they were born. That was America at its dawn. It was a sprawling agricultural nation, rich in land, but tied to the slow, steady rhythm of the seasons. It was a society powered by muscle, wood, and water. But in the space of just one lifetime, a revolutionary wave of technology and pure ambition would transform this young nation into an industrial giant. This is the story of America's dramatic march to modernity, a journey powered by steam, steel, and the wild vision of a few innovators who changed the world forever. It's a story of incredible achievement, but also profound social chaos. Fortunes built and lives broken. This is the story of the American Industrial Revolution. The revolution didn't start with a bang, but with a quiet act of industrial espionage. In the late 18th century, Great Britain was the undisputed king of industry. Its dominance was built on textile machinery so advanced. The British government made it illegal for the machines or even the mechanics who knew their secrets to leave the country. But the promise of a fortune in the New World was a powerful temptation, and that's where Samuel Slater comes in. He was an apprentice in a British cotton mill who memorized the incredibly complex designs of Richard Arkwright's spinning frames. In 1789, disguised as a common farmhand, he slipped out of England. He didn't carry any drawings or models, just a perfect blueprint etched into his memory. When he got to America, he linked up with an investor named Moses Brown, who had been trying and failing to build a working mill in Rhode Island. Using his memorized knowledge, Slater reconstructed the complex machinery from scratch. A 1793, their water-powered mill in Pawtucket was a massive success, and the American factory system was officially born. Slater would be called the father of the American Industrial Revolution, though back in England, they just called him Slater the Traitor. This little act of tech piracy wasn't a one-off. The young United States, desperate to build its own manufacturing power, basically encouraged stealing European innovations. Guys like Francis Cabot Lowell followed Slater's example, touring British factories, soaking up their designs, and then heading back to America to build even better versions. In 1814, Lowell's Boston Manufacturing Company set up the first integrated textile mill, a single factory that did everything from processing raw cotton to spitting out finished cloth. But it wasn't all just borrowed ideas. American ingenuity quickly took center stage. In 1793, the same year Slater's mill first hummed to life, a Yale grad named Eli Whitney invented a machine that would change the country's economy and social structure forever. His invention, the cotton gin, was a pretty simple device made to pull sticky seeds from short staple cotton. But its impact, monumental. The gin made growing cotton wildly profitable, which created a ravenous demand for two things: more land in the South and more enslaved labor to work it. At the same time, it supplied all the raw material needed to feed the new textile mills in the North. It locked two completely different economic systems into a dependent and ultimately destructive relationship. Whitney also championed the concept of interchangeable parts, a revolutionary manufacturing idea that would become a cornerstone of American industry. The seeds of change had been sown, watered by stolen secrets and homegrown genius, and a new industrial landscape began to sprout. As the 19th century got going, the revolution kicked into high gear, powered by two game-changing forces, steam and steel. Early mills had to be built right next to the rivers that powered them, but the perfection of the steam engine cut industry loose from its geographic chains. Factories could now pop up anywhere, giving rise to brand new industrial cities. This new power didn't just change manufacturing, it conquered distance. The sheer size of the American continent, once a massive roadblock to trade and unity, was finally being tamed. In 1807, Robert Fulton's steamboat, the Clermont, kluged its way up the Hudson River, proving that steam power could beat both wind and current. Soon, steamboats were all over the nation's great rivers, especially the Mississippi, turning them into bustling highways of trade. They moved cotton from the south, crops from the west, and factory goods from the east, stitching the country's separate regions into one big market economy. But the real giant of the age was the railroad. Starting with just a few dozen miles of track in the 1830s, the iron horse quickly spun its iron web across the entire country. Building the railroads was a colossal project that created huge demand for labor, money, and most of all, steel. The Bessemer process, and later the open hearth furnace, made it possible to mass-produce strong, cheap steel's the key ingredient for rails, locomotives, bridges, and even the skeletons of the skyscrapers that would soon scrape the sky. The railroad did more than just move goods. It moved people and completely changed how we think about time and space. It sped up westward expansion, created national markets for the very first time, and even forced the creation of standardized time zones just to make sense of its complicated schedules. A trip that used to take months by wagon could now be done in a matter of days. And when the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, the continent was finally bound together from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The railroad was the circulatory system of this new industrial economy, pumping lifeblood into every corner of the nation and setting the stage for the explosive boom of the Gilded Age. Behind all this tech were the people driving it, the brilliant inventors who dreamed up the future, and the ruthless industrialists who built it. The late 19th century was an age of heroic invention, led by figures who seemed to pull modern life right out of thin air. No inventor is more mythic in the American story than Thomas Alva Edison. From his invention factory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, Edison and his team churned out an incredible number of innovations. We remember him most for perfecting a commercially viable light bulb in 1879, which basically killed the night and made the workday longer, but his contributions were huge. The phonograph, which captured sound for the first time, and his systems for generating and distributing electricity laid the foundation for entire new industries. Edison was the embodiment of the era's belief in practical, marketable genius. And he wasn't alone. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell, a teacher for the deaf, sent the first human voice over a wire, shouting the now famous words, "Mr. Watson," "Come here, I want to see you." His invention, the telephone, would completely change how we communicate, shrinking the world in a way no one could have imagined. Inventions like the sewing machine from Elias Howe and Isaac Singer transformed how clothes were made, making them affordable for everyone, while Ottmar Mergenthaler's linotype machine automated printing, causing an explosion of newspapers and magazines that spread ideas faster than ever. These inventions created massive opportunities, and a new kind of entrepreneur rose up to grab them. Their fans called them captains of industry. Their critics called them robber barons. These were men with ambition like the world had never seen, and they piled up fortunes that dwarfed the kings of old. Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant who started as a poor kid working in a cotton mill. He ended up dominating the steel industry. He was relentless in adopting new technology and pioneered a business strategy called vertical integration, which just means he owned every single step of the process, from the iron ore mines to the railroads that shipped his finished steel. Carnegie Steel became the biggest and most profitable industrial company on the planet. Meanwhile, John D. Rockefeller was using that same brutal efficiency in the oil industry. Through his company, Standard Oil, Rockefeller didn't just want a piece of the pie, he wanted the whole damn pie. He used aggressive, cutthroat tactics to either drive his competitors out of business or swallow them into his growing empire, a strategy we now call horizontal integration. At its height, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of all oil refining in the U.S., creating a monopoly that gave him terrifying power over the nation's economy. These men, along with figures like the financier J.P. Morgan and railroad tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt, were the architects of modern American capitalism. They were builders and predators, revolutionaries who shattered old economic orders and, in the process, gained more wealth and power than royalty. The hum of the factory and the scream of the locomotive were the sounds of the new age, and they called millions away from farms and fields into the nation's rapidly growing cities. Before the Civil War, America was a mostly rural country. After, it went through one of the most dramatic population shifts in its history: urbanization. Between 1860 and 1910, the number of people living in U.S. cities exploded from 6 million to over 44 million. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh became magnets for opportunity, pulling in both native-born Americans from the countryside and a massive wave of immigrants from Europe and beyond. These new arrivals were the huge, cheap labor force that the factories desperately needed. They poured into the cities hoping for a better life. What they found was a city of extremes. The industrial city was a place of incredible energy and mind-blowing innovation, but also of unbelievable poverty and hardship. Cities grew at a chaotic, unplanned pace, and the infrastructure just couldn't keep up. Housing was a nightmare, leading to the construction of crowded, stuffy tenement buildings. It was common for multiple families to be crammed into a single, dirty apartment with almost no sunlight, fresh air, or clean water. Sanitation was a disaster. Garbage was often just tossed into the streets, and sewage systems were basic if they existed at all. In these conditions, diseases like cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis spread like wildfire. For the workers who actually powered the factories, life was a brutal, relentless cycle. The average industrial laborer worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that were barely enough to survive on. The work itself was soul-crushingly repetitive and unbelievably dangerous. Factories were packed with fast-moving machines that had no safety guards. The air was often thick with dust and chemicals. Accidents were just a part of the job, and if you got hurt, you were simply replaced. There was no workers' comp, no disability insurance. An injury that stopped you from working meant you and your family were thrown into poverty. In the middle of all this hardship, a new social order was forming. The incredible wealth created by industry gave rise to a new class of super-rich capitalists who lived in giant mansions and flaunted their money. A growing middle class of managers, clerks, and professionals also appeared, enjoying a level of comfort that was previously unheard of. But for the massive working class at the bottom, the American dream was mostly just that, a dream. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty, living in the shadow of the very progress they made possible. The American city was the crucible of modernity, forging a new, more dynamic society, but at a staggering human cost. The dazzling fortunes of the robber barons and the shiny new technologies masked a much darker reality. For millions of Americans, the Industrial Revolution wasn't an age of opportunity, was an age of brutal exploitation, and a backlash was inevitable. Workers began to realize that alone, they were powerless, but together, they might just have a voice. The modern American labor movement was born right there in the factory fires. The fight was long and often bloody. Early unions faced fierce opposition from factory owners, who had the government, the courts, and private armies of security guards on their side. Strikes were often met with overwhelming violence. The Homestead Strike of 1892 at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel plants is a perfect, brutal example. When Carnegie's manager, Henry Clay Frick, cut wages, the workers went on strike. Frick's response was to lock them out and hire 300 Pinkerton agents to break the union. The battle that followed left at least a dozen people dead and ended in a crushing defeat for the workers. But perhaps the most tragic victims of the industrial age were the children. Desperate for any income, poor families sent their kids to work. Children as young as 7 years old worked in factories and mines for pennies. Their small size made them perfect for jobs like scrambling under active machinery to clear jams or crawling into dangerously tight mine shafts. They had injury rates far higher than adults and were robbed of an education and a childhood. These horrific conditions slowly started to bother the nation's conscience. Journalists, who became known as muckrakers, wrote shocking on the reality of life in the tenements and factories. Social reformers, like Jane Addams at her Hull House in Chicago, worked to provide services and support for the city's poor. And slowly, painstakingly, the labor movement began to score some wins. The price of progress was steep, paid in exhaustion, injury, and lives cut short. The opposition to the unchecked power of industrial capitalism wasn't a rejection of progress itself. It was a demand that the benefits of that progress be shared more fairly. It was a fight to humanize the industrial machine, to insist that the people who ran the factories were more than just disposable parts. This struggle would redefine the relationship between capital and labor and lay the groundwork for many of the worker protections we take for granted today. If you're enjoying this trip into America's industrial past, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think was the single biggest change the Industrial Revolution brought. From Samuel Slater's stolen secrets to the warm glow of Edison's light bulb, America's journey to modernity was a period of breathtaking change. In less than 100 years, the United States completely remade itself. An agrarian republic became an industrial empire. Wooden sailing ships were replaced by steel-hulled steamships, and horse-drawn carts gave way to continent-spanning railroads. This was the era that forged the very foundations of the modern world. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution is everywhere. It gave us mass production, which filled our homes with affordable stuff. It created the technologies that still run our lives and the transportation networks that connect us all. It drove the growth of our cities and built the economic structures of modern capitalism. It's what turned the United States into a global economic superpower, setting the stage for what would be called the American century. But that legacy is also complicated. The same engine of progress that created unimaginable wealth also created unimaginable inequality. The same factories that cranked out modern marvels also subjected people to horrific conditions. The same urban growth that sparked innovation also bred poverty and disease. To understand America today, you have to understand this pivotal era. The debates it ignited over corporate power, workers' rights, the role of government, and the human cost of economic growth are debates we're still having. The Industrial Revolution was America's turbulent, violent, and brilliant coming of age. It was the moment the nation stepped out of its agricultural past and strode, with audacious and often ruthless determination, straight into the modern world.